today for a discussion on tax policy. I'm Wendy Edelberg, Director of the Hamilton Project. We are delighted to have White House National Economic Advisor Lael Brainard here to discuss the administration's tax policy priorities. We are approaching a crucial time in tax policy. Many of the provisions in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act are scheduled to expire in 2025, setting the stage for rigorous and consequential debates. Today's event is an important part of a series of work and events the Hamilton Project has undertaken to inform those debates. If policymakers work to enact new legislation rather than simply letting the 2017 Tax Act provisions expire, they have an opportunity to improve the tax code, strengthen economic security, and stabilize the fiscal trajectory. If you care about climate change, you should care about tax reform. Much of U.S. climate policy currently operates through the tax code. If you care about maintaining American competitiveness, you should care about tax reform. Aligning the U.S. tax code with international standards would level the playing field for U.S. multinational corporations. If you care about reducing poverty, you should care about tax reform. Strengthening the child tax credit and earned income tax credit would support children, workers, and many others. Okay, but what values should guide tax reform? In their THP policy proposal, Kim Klossing and Natasha Sarin offer 4 principles to guide tax policy choices. They argue that reform should raise revenue on net to restore financial stability, enhance productivity, progressivity, minimize distortions and inefficiencies, which would indeed enhance productivity, tackle global collective action problems, and altogether, Klossing and Sarin offer a menu of policy reforms that would raise $3.5 trillion over the coming decade. That would roughly stabilize the debt-to-GDP ratio while improving progressivity and efficiency of the system. Paying for our spending priorities through well-designed tax policy instead of borrowing would increase economic output. It would also help if we improved the sensibleness of our tax system. But the evidence from modern U.S. fiscal policy shows that tax reform would likely only have a small effect on aggregate output in the long term, which is to say, the focus on how proposed tax reform will affect GDP is often misplaced. Ben Harris and I reviewed 8 major tax reforms since 1986, and we found no tax reform has appreciably affected the size of the economy in the long term. A key example is the 2017 Tax Act. Research showed it only had a small effect on the size of the economy now, 7 years later. But it did change the progressivity of the code, and it did shift the way we finance federal spending from revenues to borrowing. Policymakers should prioritize the consideration of these effects on revenues, behavior, and income over a tax reform's projected impact on aggregate output. Today, we continue our tax policy discussion with Lael Brainard. Lael leads the White House National Economic Council, advising the President on U.S. and global economic policy. She previously served as Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, the Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, and, of course, Vice President and Director of Global Economy and Development here at Brookings. We're so glad she can join us today. And for those in the room, you can submit questions by writing on an index card and raising it for a staff member to collect. For those of you joining us online, you can tweet us at Hamilton Project, tweet us at, or X us at Hamilton Proj, or with the hashtag tax policy, or email us at info@hamiltonproject.org. Thank you, and I would now like to invite Lael to the stage. Thanks.
Well, good morning. And thank you, Wendy, for that terrific introduction. It's great to be here at Hamilton. As we all know, following the devastation that we saw during the pandemic, we saw major legislation, and now we are seeing the best labor market that we have seen as a country in 50 years. We're seeing gains in real purchasing power and wealth for the middle class. But we have a major economic policy decision that lies ahead, whether to return to the trickle-down policies of the past or forge ahead with a different approach, the president's approach to grow the economy from the middle out and the bottom up. The expiration of President Trump's 2017 tax package next year will put the issue of tax fairness front and center. Do we want a tax system that favors the wealthy or the middle class? Tax fairness is central to the president's approach to building an economy that works for all Americans, where growth is broadly shared and everyone has a fair shot, where we reduce fiscal risks and keep our commitments to seniors. This week, the Congressional Budget Office confirmed that the full extension of Trump's tax package would add nearly $5 trillion to our national debt over the next decade, while disproportionately benefiting the ultra-wealthy. So it's clear we need to end the 2017 tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy and scale back costly, permanent corporate tax breaks. With the debate that is looming, I thought it would be useful to lay out the clear differences between the Republican plans and a tax code that works for the middle class. Republican plans make the tax system more unfair, and they jeopardize our fiscal health. How do they do that? They do it by doubling down on the 2017 tax cuts, which did not deliver the benefits that were promised. The 2017 biggest tax cuts went to the wealthiest Americans. Those in the top 1% received tax cuts worth over 50 times those of middle-income households. And the trickle-down never happened. The prior administration promised growth, and these are quotes, of 4, 5, maybe even 6%. But actually the economy and fixed investments grew at about the same rate in the 2 years after the passage of the tax package as the 2 years prior. The Trump administration at the time claimed those tax cuts would cause household wages to increase by at least $4,000, but the Congressional Research Service found no evidence, that's a quote, of an increase in wages after the TCJA. Instead, top executives saw their wages rise by nearly $50,000, and workers below the 90th percentile saw no wage increases. The corporate tax cuts did see a surge in stock buybacks that benefited wealthy and foreign investors. Now, the current Republican tax plan would continue those tax cuts for the wealthy, giving the top 0.1% of households average annual tax cuts of $175,000 each per year, and it would go further. It would cut capital gains taxes and eliminate the estate tax that currently applies only to that wealthiest 0.1%. It proposes nearly $1 trillion more in corporate tax cuts, including eliminating the Inflation Reduction Act's corporate minimum tax and the stock buybacks tax. That's not all. There are proposals to eliminate the investment in the IRS that came in the Inflation Reduction Act would add hundreds of billions of dollars to the deficit and make it easier for the wealthiest to evade paying what they owe. Meanwhile, Republican opposition to implementing the global minimum tax agreement is rewarding corporations that invest abroad rather than in America. And let's remember, those tax cuts didn't pay for themselves, and they won't pay for themselves. The TCJA has come nowhere near paying for its $1.9 trillion cost. Revenues were projected to be over 18% of GDP in 2023 before the tax cuts passed, but revenues have turned out to be only 16.5% of GDP. That's a shortfall of $400 billion. CBO estimates unpaid for extensions of the tax package would increase primary deficits by over 1% of GDP over the next decade. That is the long-standing magical thinking of trickle-down. The Bush tax cuts, their extensions, and the Trump tax cuts have added $10 trillion to the national debt. That accounts for 90% of the non-emergency increases in the debt-to-GDP ratio since 2001. There's no reason to believe another round of lopsided tax cuts would turn out any differently. So it's past time to reject the Republican argument that tax cuts should not be offset. Republicans will likely respond to fiscal pressures created by those unpaid-for tax cuts by pushing for draconian cuts to Social Security and Medicare. They've already raised taxes for millions of Americans by opposing the extension at the end of 2021 of the president's expansions of the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit. And they also proposed to actually increase taxes on middle-class families by eliminating the president's premium tax credit expansions that would raise the cost of health insurance for millions of Americans, and they'd eliminate tax credits worth thousands of dollars for families installing a heat pump or solar panels. Even now, it appears that Senate Republican leaders are holding out on helping working families this year so they can set up their agenda for next year to deliver tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy. The president is fighting for a better approach. Let me take a short few minutes to describe the 5 common sense principles that guides that approach. First, our tax system should be fair. It should reward work, not wealth. It should give tax cuts to working and middle-class families to give them a fair shot while asking the wealthiest households to pay their fair share. The president is committed to ensuring that the over 95% of American households that earn less than $400,000 don't pay any more in taxes. He has stood by that pledge. He will stand by that pledge. He's gone further. He's proposed tax cuts for millions of families to help them invest in their children, make work pay, and secure health insurance, building on the targeted tax cuts in the American Rescue Plan and Inflation Reduction Act that Republicans have fought to eliminate. The expansion of the premium tax credits has made health insurance more affordable for millions of Americans purchasing coverage on the ACA marketplace. This expansion helped lift health insurance coverage to record levels of over 21 million people. The expansion will lapse if there's no action by the fall of 2025. The expansion of the child tax credit cut child poverty nearly in half in 2021 by allowing low-income families to access the full credit for the first time. Despite that documented effectiveness, Republicans did not extend the expansion, causing 3 million children to fall into poverty. Restoring the expanded child credit would lift those children out of poverty and cut taxes by an average of $2,600 for 39 million families. And restoring the expansion of the EITC would cut taxes by an average of $800 per year for 19 million low-paid workers, especially younger workers. Achieving a fairer tax system also means we can't extend expiring Trump tax cuts for those with incomes above $400,000 or bring back deductions and other tax breaks for those households. As the president has said, tax cuts for the wealthy will stay expired on his watch. Second, tax policy in 2025 should raise revenue consistent with the president's strong commitment to fiscal responsibility. At minimum, we should avoid making the fiscal hole created by Republican tax cuts deeper by fully paying for any tax cuts that are extended. And we should use the 2025 tax debate as an opportunity to raise revenue overall. The evidence is clear. Tax cuts don't pay for themselves. So it's past time to reject this argument that tax cuts uniquely shouldn't be offset. Since the TCJA was enacted, revenue as a share of GDP has averaged 17% of GDP compared to over 19% in the 5 years leading up to the Bush tax cuts. So the revenue share is going down at the very time we need revenue to go up to meet commitments on programs that are the bedrock of financial security for Americans. Our seniors earned their Social Security and Medicare benefits paycheck by paycheck. As the president has made clear, he rejects Republican efforts to cut those benefits or put health care and other programs that families count on at risk. Third, corporations that are making record profits should contribute their fair share. Does it make sense for corporations' share of tax responsibilities to be at multi-decade lows when corporate profits are very high? That question should be at the center of next year's tax debate. Recent evidence has shown that targeted investment incentives are more effective in boosting productivity-enhancing business investment than the unconditional large tax cuts enacted in 2017. Our tax system currently asks much less of corporations than it used to. In the 1950s, around 70% of our revenue came from labor income and 30% from corporate income. Today, around 90% comes from labor income and under 10% comes from corporate income. That doesn't make any sense. We also ask far less of corporations than other large economies. In 2022, our corporate tax receipts were about 1.6% of GDP, half the OECD average, owing in part to the Trump tax cuts. The lackluster investment response to the Trump tax cuts suggests that bringing corporate taxation more in line with past U.S. and current international practice could raise substantial revenue without in any way hindering growth. The president's budget would scale back those corporate tax rate cut by bringing the corporate tax rate to 28%, only halfway back to the previous 35% rate. It would build on the IRA's minimum tax on billion-dollar corporations by increasing the rate from 15% to 21% and boost the stock buybacks tax from 1% to 4% to encourage investors and corporations to invest in their workers and the broader economy rather than payouts. Even with those changes, corporate income taxes as a share of the economy would be similar to their levels in the mid-2000s and peer countries. Fourth, taxpayers should pay what they owe and play by the same rules. That seems very straightforward. The IRS should have the resources it needs to identify and address tax evasion by wealthy people, complex partnerships, and large corporations, and also to provide adequate customer service and a smooth tax filing experience to the vast majority of filers who are trying to pay what they owe. They've suffered a decade of severe underfunding, and the current investment in modernizing the IRS is already paying off. The IRS demonstrated exemplary customer service this tax filing season, successfully piloted direct file, and launched new initiatives aimed at high-end noncompliance. This investment will lapse without action, starting with the IRS taxpayer service cliff in 2026. It's really important to protect the IRA funding. And finally, our tax system should avoid an international race to the bottom. The historic multilateral agreement signed by more than 130 nations will finally address that race to the bottom on corporate taxes while enabling businesses to compete and allocate capital based on market factors, not tax planning factors. Many of the world's largest economies are already implementing this transformational agreement. We need to join them next year. The president's proposal would implement the agreement and impose a 21% minimum tax on the foreign profits of the biggest multinationals. So just to sum up, as we approach the tax debate next year, the stakes could not be higher for the fairness of our tax system and our nation's fiscal future. We're fighting for a fair tax system that gives the middle class a tax break and raises revenue by asking the ultra-wealthy and large corporations to simply pay their fair share. The contrast with the previous trickle-down approach couldn't be clearer. Thank you.
So thank you for those remarks. That was super. Since the expiration of so many of the provisions in the 2017 Tax Act is providing this opportunity, let's start there. I have a couple of questions for you on that. So the Hamilton Project had an event last fall where there seemed to be some bipartisan agreement about some good aspects of the 2017 Tax Act. For example, the higher standard deduction that made the tax code more sensible and a little more efficient. Are there things about the 2017 Tax Act you like?
Yeah, so look, I think when we get into that discussion, what's most important is the principle that the tax for the tax burden for people who earn under $400,000 should not change. And that is the most important piece. And there are loads of different ways you can get to that outcome. And there are elements of the 2017 tax reforms that we have proposed building on. So, for instance, we'd like to see a global minimum tax put in place that is consistent with our international obligations. We've actually suggested doing that at the rate of 21%. So, of course, we can build on the GILTI in that tax package. There are a variety of other aspects, but what is really important is that none of the expiring provisions for the wealthiest Americans, those making over $400,000, be extended. And that we need to pay for extending or holding harmless the tax status of people under $400,000.
Yes, certainly the international provisions were also brought up as some of the things that people were surprised in retrospect that they don't hate about the 2017 Tax Act. So you talked about the Republican plans. You obviously talked about the administration's priorities. And there are lots of possible outcomes that is a compromise between those two if legislation gets passed. But there's another possible outcome, which is that no legislation gets passed. And indeed, all of the expiring provisions expire and we, move along with current law. Where do you rank that in the list of outcomes of, is it better or worse than other outcomes? And of course, what I'm really curious about is, do you think it's better or worse than what the Republicans have proposed?
Yeah, so what I would say is, again, I think we've taken an approach which is to lay out very clearly what our principles for that tax debate would be, to allow some flexibility exactly how those provisions are put together to respect those principles. I have to say that any outcome that does not preserve the current tax breaks for the middle class is one that the president wouldn't be able to accept and seems very implausible to me that you would have Republicans denying tax breaks for the middle class in order to simply, clearly, only extend tax breaks for the ultra wealthy. So while there's loads of possible outcomes here, we're going to continue to really push hard for the outcomes that I discussed, which are we need to extend the tax breaks for the middle class, people earning under $400,000, and we need to raise revenues. That means we have to allow those provisions that favor the ultra wealthy to expire in order to make sure they pay their fair share and raise revenue.
Well, so let me press on that a little bit. We're obviously, when we're talking about these sorts of policy outcomes, we're obviously talking about a world where Biden is our next president. So let's posit that. But we don't know what the makeup of the House and the Senate will be. And so are you saying that under that scenario, given all of the possible outcomes that you could have in the House and the Senate, you don't see a world where policymakers aren't able to come to a compromise? Sorry, there were a lot of double negatives in that sentence.
So I don't know. Obviously, as you said, there's loads of different ways that the world could evolve between now and next year. What we can do and what the president committed to do is be very transparent about his position going into this major decision about our fiscal future and the fairness of our tax system. And so he's been very clear He talks about this a lot. He talked about in the State of the Union. For him, what's important is honoring his commitment to people who earn below $400,000 and raising revenue to put us as a nation on a solid fiscal trajectory and to make sure that we can continue making the necessary investments and honoring our commitments to seniors and other people that we have commitments to. And so exactly how that shakes out, I think is something that it's a little bit hard to speculate at this juncture, but those are the critical things that need to happen next year.
All right, so we'll move on from the 2017 Tax Act. What other priorities do you want to put on the table that have nothing to do with what's in the 2017 Tax Act or what's going to expire out of the 2017 Tax Act?
So, as I noted, corporate tax revenues as a share of GDP are simply too low. They are too low for the nation's fiscal health. They are lower than they were in previous decades when corporate profits as a share of GDP were actually lower. Makes no sense. And they are half the share of GDP that you see OECD as average. So obviously it's important. The president has secured some gains on that front, but critically important, we now know that the massive reduction in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% did not yield the promised growth benefits, and there's really no justification for keeping it that level. He's proposed moving it from 21% to 28%, only halfway back. That raises a remarkably large amount of revenue, well over $1 trillion. We need to do that. The president has secured a corporate minimum tax. We need to increase that further. He put that in the president's budget for 2025. We also have proposed expanding, quadrupling the stock buybacks tax, which he secured in the Inflation Reduction Act, because we've seen a massive amount of activity in a very strong economy in that regard. And then, of course, in addition to implementing the global minimum tax, where we believe the rationale is incredibly compelling, we'd also like to make sure that people who earn over $100 million per year, who currently pay an average of 8% on their income, pay something more on the order of what a school teacher or a firefighter would pay 25% on their income. And so that's another really important one, raises $500 billion over a decade, important revenue raiser, very important to tax fairness, very resonant with a lot of people that I talk to.
Indeed. So one of the things that you talked about was in the list of Republican priorities is the Republicans' desire to repeal some of the subsidies that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, subsidies that are particularly important for the administration's efforts to fight climate change. So even in absence of their passing legislation, which is a pretty high hurdle these days, one can imagine, if we have a Republican administration, some significant changes in the way the IRA and maybe even other recent pieces of legislation are implemented. So is that on your mind? And what protections can you put in place, or are there protections you can put in place to prevent significant changes in implementation that undo the president's priorities?
Yeah. So first, most importantly, the Inflation Reduction Act, clean energy tax credits are the law of the land. And under any scenario, I would expect the law to be implemented faithfully. We have seen, as of the end of this month, 21 of the 24 tax credits, all of the ones that are operative. There are a few that won't be operative until next year, but all of the ones that are operative have been promulgated by Treasury and the IRS, and those are now in place, and people are already implementing. We have nearly $200 billion worth of investments associated with the clean energy provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. There are already people hard at work building plants and being employed at plants, whether it be at batteries, solar, wind, EVs. We've had 100,000 Americans take advantage of the EV tax credits. We have 60,000 tax filers who have filed to participate, there's taxpayers who have filed to participate in either transferability or direct pay for 60,000 clean energy projects that are registered. There's a lot of forward momentum there, and so I would anticipate that under any circumstances, the law will be faithfully implemented.
So this is not on your list of concerns? You think that the way that the IRA has been implemented is basically insulates it from a future administration that is less committed to the priorities in the IRA?
So, again, this is now the tax code.
Yeah.
These rules are complex. They take a very long time to write, and they take a very long time to amend. They require public comment, and they require a lot of hard work on the part of staff at the IRS to undertake those kinds of activities. And I will say the investor community, the business community, the labor community, they are going to strongly advocate for these projects, this employment, these transformative projects that are in communities all around the country. And don't forget the analysis that's been done suggests that these projects are disproportionately in Republican districts. And although many of the Republican members oppose the Inflation Reduction Act, they are now loudly cheering on the investments that are in their districts. So there's a lot of momentum and a lot of excitement behind the factories and the transformation of the grid that is going on all over the country.
So let me remind everybody that you can get cards when you came in. If you have questions that you want me to ask, raise your card and a staff member will pick them up. And for those of you online, again, feel free to tweet or email if you have questions. So it sounds like the Biden tax plan has two priorities that are in some ways in competition with each other. One is raising revenues to improve the fiscal trajectory. And another is to raise revenues in order to finance the president's priorities, either through lowering taxes relative to current law or presumably funding spending priorities. Am I right in thinking that there's a trade-off between these two things? And then if I am, how do you think about that trade-off?
Yeah. So let me start by just resting on one point that you just made, which is a really important one. The president has put forward proposals to pay for the middle-class tax cuts that he is committed to. So we believe that you need to raise revenue in order to offset tax cuts. The Republicans will not even acknowledge that principle, and that is one of the interesting things about the tax package that is not moving forward right now that would benefit working families, that would provide tax credits for housing, that is currently not moving forward in the Senate because it actually pays for itself. So that's a really important priority, a really important distinction, and I think we should hold Republicans accountable for paying for any tax cuts that they propose. And in terms of the importance of doing both, I think it is absolutely essential that we show how we're going to pay for the investments in the nation's future, in particular, for instance, the child tax credit. And it's very important that we are able to show how we will pay for honoring commitments that have been made over generations. So those two things we don't see as in conflict with each other. We just think it's good kind of budgeting to both be clear about which tax cuts need to be preserved, or expanded, and then the revenues. And I just laid out for you a long list of where we think there is room to raise revenues in a way that is efficient and is consistent with ongoing growth in the economy.
So there's likely to be, in a second Biden administration, there's likely to be two robust debates. One, obviously, the tax debate. We just can't get away from that one. But presumably, looking at the president's budget, there will also be a debate about future spending priorities. Should we think about, and in the president's budget, those are obviously laid out, quite reasonably so, as a collection of policies that work together fiscally. Should we? But my guess is that these debates, as they happen, over the next years, will happen sequentially. That first we'll have the tax debate, and then we'll have a spending debate. Maybe you disagree, but if that's right, should I think about then the spending priorities being constrained by whatever it is that the effective compromise, that has generated in terms of revenues that give the president some leeway to fund his spending priorities?
Yeah, so look, I think we try to think holistically about, we've laid out the president's priorities, we try to be transparent about what they might cost, and we try to be transparent about where we see the potential areas of revenue that advance the principle of asking those who have an abundance to pay their fair share, corporations who are making record profits to pay their fair share. So we try to think about those things. We think it's essential to think about those holistically. Now, you're certainly right that the way these decisions could be made, there's a whole host of different sequences that one could imagine, but we're going to try to bring a holistic set of principles, and in fact, we talk about those in the budget, to those debates. And again, I think what's very important is to not have a debate on the one hand about tax cuts where we sort of have a Republican assertion that they pay for themselves, so we don't need to pay for them by raising revenue elsewhere, and then an investment and spending debate where somehow it's suggested that a different principle should apply. Right. We think you need a consistent principle across both debates.
So I have a question for you about the role of tax experts. And we have a bunch of people here in the room, and I know we have hundreds of people listening online. And I know from the RSVP list that many of them have a lot of expertise in tax. And so what guidance can you be giving us and them about how we can be helpful? Which is to say, where's more analysis needed? Where would our expertise be a useful input into the debate to make sure that we don't lose this opportunity?
Yeah, so I think the Biden administration really relies heavily on independent expertise, very heavily. The tax experts, I think, have an incredibly important role to play. Certainly CBO and JCT, those are institutionalized places that we look to. But it's also true that there are a number of think tanks and policy research centers, university policy research centers. That
like say?
I mean, yeah, I don't know. That we think are extremely important to our debate. So I think, Wendy, you're a prime example of what you bring to the debate. It's really trying to take something that is incredibly complicated, intentionally sometimes complicated, and try to clarify what is at stake. Distribution is critically important in all tax discussions. And so the statistics about who actually got the benefits from the 2017 tax cuts that I cited earlier, those are really important for the public to understand and to have independent experts doing that analysis and explaining. If you think that these benefits are going to help you, who earn $300,000 a year, let me tell you who's actually going to get the tax cut benefit here. That's really important. But similarly, the the work that you all do on growth effects, employment effects, distribution effects. All of those things should go into our views about how to assess these tax policies. And those are also important to the debate about saying, well, these tax cuts, for instance, the massive amount of revenue that was given up from corporations, rigorous assessments to show whether or not they had an effect on growth, employment, wages. Those are the assessments that I look to say, actually, no, they didn't. And that is why if we were to raise corporate tax rate from 21 to 28, as the president's proposed, halfway back, we're unlikely to see the kind of growth effects that Republicans asserted at the time they put it in place, just as an example.
And certainly any positive effects from lowering tax rates, which, surely there are positive effects if you lower tax rates, have to be weighed against the negative effects of financing our spending by borrowing.
Absolutely.
Rather than sensible tax policy.
I think you've contributed to this literature. For instance, the child tax credit.
Right.
The child tax credit, I think outside independent analysis is pretty impressive about the effects there in terms of that money being used to invest in children and also to enable lower income parents to participate in the labor force, so a kind of double positive.
So I want to give you an opportunity to talk more about IRS funding. On this same stage, I asked Natasha Sarin, who's been a huge proponent of effectively funding the IRS and how that money not only creates a more useful, user-friendly, and efficient IRS, but also helps the IRS have the abilities that they need in order to effectively collect revenue. So I want to give you an opportunity. I essentially asked her the same question, which I'd like to ask you. Hey, is it a good idea to give the IRS more money?
So look, I think you have to ask that question against the backdrop of a decade of underfunding. So the IRS has been dramatically underfunded and has been, as a result, unable to do the kind of work that's necessary to fulfill its responsibilities under the law. With the funding that was provided to the IRS in the Inflation Reduction Act, I always find this hard to say, the IRS funding, we have already seen some really positive effects. So we also know that the tax service funding has led to large drops in wait times this year. Just for your typical tax filer who does not, try to evade paying their taxes, better customer service. We now have a direct file. More than 140,000 people, I think, have taken advantage of it. Customer service on that is extremely high. That's important, but it's also important because some people, wealthy people in certain types of entities, are able to take advantage of the enormous complexity of the tax code to essentially evade paying what they owe. And you really do need the technology and the personnel in order to have resources to make sure that people are paying what they owe. And there, too, the IRS has already put out a report showing hundreds of millions of dollars of additional tax filings this year. So we think this is just an investment. It's a smart investment, and it makes up for past underfunding.
So we have an interesting question from the audience. And I'll read it just as it's written, but then offer my own thoughts of how to frame the question. So the question is: should corporations not claim IRA incentives to invest in green economy in order to ensure they pay their fair share in taxes? And so there's some interesting questions there about both. We offer subsidies to corporations to nudge them to do things that we think have a payoff in either a social sense or an economic sense, but also there's a question as to should we just be? It's a silly question, so I'm just putting up the straw man to I think just let you knock it down, which is should fair-minded people who actually believe in a better, more progressive tax system, should we be just asking them to pay more in taxes?
Yeah, so look, we think that we should be asking corporations overall to pay more in taxes. That's why we proposed increasing the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. We put in place a corporate minimum, a stock buyback. We want to increase both of those. Those are basic principles of fairness and the amount of revenue that needs to be raised. I think of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits as providing the necessary market signal for necessary investments in our clean energy future. And I say it because the current market signals, in the absence of that, don't take into account, it's kind of a classic market failure, don't take into account the broader benefit to society of making this transition and going down the cost curve on new technologies, as well as some of the established technologies that are available to transition to the clean energy future. So I think of those as enabling the kinds of investments in capital markets that otherwise might not meet that investment hurdle in the absence of those, but that the return to our society overall is greater than the private return, and that's where the tax code is helping to offset that discrepancy. So I put them in a somewhat different category.
But sometimes, like when somebody like Warren Buffett says, it's absurd that I pay less in taxes than my secretary.
Yes.
Then sometimes I think, poorly thought out response to that is, well then, Mr. Warren Buffett, you should just pay more in taxes, and that will solve our problems. Like, I don't know,
Yeah, so if the question is, should we rely on, publicly minded people
Yes.
to simply pay more than they owe, I mean, unfortunately, just hasn't worked. So that is why we think
Yes.
That when people who earn over $100 million on average pay 8% of their income in taxes, whereas people who are squarely in the middle class are, like teachers and firefighters paying a great deal more than that, we actually need to just ask the billionaires, the multimillionaires,
Yes.
to pay a higher rate of tax in the tax code. That is the only way I think we're going to get a, sort of broad, necessary amount of revenue that we need as a society.
Excellent. So before we get to, I'm coming back to the 2017 Tax Act. Before we get to the date when these provisions expire, we are very likely going to have a debt ceiling debate. What role does that play in this debate? Is it, I don't know. I mean, so I guess, I'm trying not to just ask the question of like, how is the debt ceiling the dumbest thing, or like, just a dumb thing? So I'm trying to ask a more substantive question, which is, some people have said that the debt ceiling, however bad that they think it is actually a useful opportunity to talk about compromises around the tax system. Do you think that this debt ceiling debate offers an opportunity to start the more substantive debate, or is it just a bad?
Yeah, so I've been in this administration and the Obama administration around these moments of the debt limit coming into focus. I have found those moments to be completely unproductive. Part of the reason they're unproductive is because the debt limit is entirely redundant to the budgeting process that we already have in place. Part of the reason that it is worse than redundant is because we don't have, on the Republican side of the aisle, they simply won't talk about including revenue in that broader discussion. So how can you really talk about solving the nation's future fiscal trajectory unless you look at both investments and expenditures and revenues, in a sort of equivalent manner. And so I don't find it to be productive. The president, I think, has been, very clear about that. But of course, we'll continue to bring our principles to the tax debate, which is going to be very important next year because of the expiration of the 2017 Trump tax cuts, as well as all of the fiscal discussions, which will also be very important. And, we've tried to be transparent in our 2025 budget proposal that the president put forward as to how we think those different aspects of our fiscal health should be addressed.
So we have another question from the audience. I think this was actually sent in by somebody online, that about tax preparation services and the exorbitant fees paid by tax preparation services. And it's been a priority of lots of tax experts for a lot of time in a lot of administrations to improve tax preparation services that are provided particularly to low-income people. Can you talk a little bit about that and where that is in the list of priorities?
Well, I would say, we had a remarkably positive experience this year with Direct File. IRS put a great platform tool out into the public arena. People with relatively simple tax returns were able to use it and able to complete their tax returns in a record short amount of time. The customer service experience was very positive. And mostly we're getting questions from many parts of the country. When will that be available to me? And, can you expand this service? So our general sense is that it should not be costly. It should not cost you $400 to file your taxes. And the Direct File tool enables you to do that without paying those kinds of fees. And over time, I expect it to be more broadly available to more taxpayers. I think that's a very positive development, and particularly for low-income people.
Such low-hanging fruit. All right, so then now, after thinking about just issues that are going to come up on the calendar, after 2025, some years after, we will get to the point where it is projected that the trust funds for Social Security and other trust funds will run dry, which is to say, right now their Social Security system, just for everybody, you know this, is paying benefits partly by dipping into its trust fund because the revenues that are coming in are not enough to pay the benefits right now. And at a certain point in the 2030s, there will not be any more money in that account. And under current law, the Social Security system will be constrained to only pay benefits based on the revenues that are coming in any given day. And there are different ways of thinking about this. One is that people who are scheduled to be, in their lives, think that they're going to be, able to receive Social Security benefits in the 2030s should be really worried about this. On the flip side, I've heard some people express optimism that this will be a really good opportunity for us to fix the Social Security system. So where do you see this debate?
Yeah, so I think the contrast here is very important. So the Republican Study Committee has put out a plan that would essentially cut Social Security benefits by about 13% by extending the retirement age. That is their solution. We should cut Americans' Social Security benefits. The president does not believe that. The president believes that Americans who are coming to retirement age have paid into their Social Security every month for their working lifetimes, and that we should honor those commitments. And so he put some principles out in the budget which essentially say we should protect Social Security benefits, and we should do that by raising revenue. We should do that by asking people over $400,000 to pay a greater share into Social Security. And as you know, there's currently a maximum, and as a result, people who earn below that maximum are paying a much greater share of their income than people who earn more than $400,000. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about exactly how you do that, but I think the experts that have looked at this will confirm that you can greatly extend the solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund by simply asking people over $400,000 to pay their fair share.
And do you see that being, those issues coming up in the 2025 tax debate, or do you see those issues really just being put off until we're closer to insolvency?
So I don't know exactly what the sequence of discussions will be, but this is a central issue, and we believe it's extremely important to tackle it, both for our nation's fiscal future health, but also to make sure that we have the revenues we need to honor our commitments to our seniors. So we would like to have this debate. It's one of the very important debates about fairness, about protecting Social Security, which is the president's approach, or cutting it, which has been the Republican Study Committee approach. And of course, we believe that there is a way to extend and honor those commitments simply by asking the ultra-wealthy to pay their fair share.
And I've been involved in conversations where people have said, oh, this is silly. We're clearly just going to pay the benefits out of general revenues. Like, this is, like, the way we're clearly going to solve this problem is to get rid of the trust fund altogether. It's an accounting gimmick, and Congress will pass legislation to pay the benefits out of general revenues, and that will be and they'll do that 6 months before the deadline. Is that, how does that strike? Like, I don't know, thoughts?
So any way you cut it, we need to raise revenue, and it is just the right thing to do, the fair thing to do, to ask large corporations and the ultra-wealthy, who are doing very well, to pay their fair share in order to be able to honor those commitments, in order to be able to put our nation on a solid fiscal trajectory. So exactly what the mechanism is, that is going to be debated. But what is clear is that we need to ask ultra-wealthy people and corporations to pay their fair share.
I'd like to end on on a question about how optimistic you are. So everybody talks about, we've talked, in so many conversations on this stage about how polarized the current environment is, how difficult it is to get things done in Washington these days. Are you optimistic about Congress being able to use this opportunity to improve tax policy?
I believe that these are completely solvable problems. I think the president is taking a common sense, fair approach that focuses on giving middle-class people a fair shot, asking the most fortunate to pay their fair share. I think there's a very common sense approach to solving these important problems, and there's simply no excuse for not doing so.
Well, thank you, Lil Brainard. Please join me in thanking Lael for joining us today.